When retired Army Sergeant Marcus Rivera found his German Shepherd, Atlas, leading two starving cheetah cubs to his doorstep in rural Montana, he thought he was hallucinating from his PTSD medication. But what happened over the next 3 months would challenge everything he knew about loyalty, healing, and the unbreakable bonds between species, ultimately forcing him to make the most heartbreaking decision of his life. The October morning mist clung to the vast grasslands surrounding Marcus's isolated ranch, 20 miles outside of Billings, Montana. The 800-acre property had been his grandfather's cattle ranch, but Marcus had converted it into a quiet refuge after returning from 3 tours in Afghanistan. The rolling hills, dotted with cottonwood trees, and the endless sky provided the solitude he desperately needed after years of combat stress and the loss of his entire unit in an IED explosion near Kandahar. Marcus had served as a military working dog handler for 12 years, specializing in explosive detection and search and rescue operations. His partnership with various military dogs had saved countless lives, and he understood canine behavior better than most people understood humans. After his medical discharge due to severe PTSD and chronic pain from shrapnel wounds, the transition to civilian life had been devastating. His wife, Sarah, had left 2 years ago, unable to cope with his nightmares and emotional withdrawal. His 2 teenage children lived with her in Seattle, visiting only during holidays. Atlas, a 4-year-old German Shepherd, had been his constant companion since leaving the military. The dog had been retired from service due to a minor hip injury and was scheduled for euthanization when Marcus intervened. Together, they had found a rhythm on the ranch, Marcus tending to a small herd of rescue horses, and Atlas patrolling the property with the dedication of a soldier who never forgot his training. The ranch sat at the edge of the Beartooth Wilderness, where wildlife was abundant but typically kept its distance from human habitation. Marcus had chosen this location specifically for its isolation, needing space to process his trauma away from crowds and sudden noises that triggered his anxiety. Most days passed in comfortable silence, with only the wind through grass and the occasional call of hawks overhead. Neither Marcus nor Atlas had any idea that their carefully constructed peace was about to be shattered by an event that would change their lives forever. 3 days earlier, a catastrophic wildfire had swept through the Beartooth National Forest, forcing the emergency evacuation of Wildcat Springs Exotic Animal Sanctuary, a controversial private facility located 45 miles northeast of Marcus's ranch. The sanctuary, owned by wealthy businessman Thomas Blackwood, housed over 60 exotic animals, including tigers, lions, and a small family of African cheetahs. Local authorities had long questioned the facility's safety protocols and animal welfare standards, but Blackwood's political connections and expensive lawyers had kept investigations at bay. The fire moved faster than anyone anticipated, driven by unprecedented drought conditions and fierce winds reaching 60 miles per hour. Emergency responders had less than 4 hours to evacuate the animals, loading them into hastily arranged transport trucks bound for temporary facilities across 3 states. In the chaos and smoke, with visibility near zero and flames approaching the perimeter fence, several transport cages were damaged during the frantic loading process. Among the casualties was a reinforced enclosure containing Kessie, a 6-year-old female cheetah, and her 2 4-month-old cubs, Django and Amara. Born in captivity at another questionable facility in Texas before being sold to Wildcat Springs, Kessie had never experienced true wilderness. Her cubs had been hand-raised by sanctuary staff after complications during birth left Kessie unable to nurse properly. The damaged transport cage door had torn completely off when the truck hit a deep pothole on the rough evacuation route, allowing the terrified family to escape into the smoke-filled forest. Sanctuary staff discovered the escape 12 hours later, but by then, the fire had consumed thousands of acres, making search efforts impossible. Blackwood made the decision to report only the loss due to fire to insurance companies and authorities, claiming the animals had perished in the blaze rather than escaped. This deliberate cover-up was motivated by his fear of legal liability if the exotic predators harmed someone, and his desire to collect insurance money rather than fund expensive recovery operations. For 3 days, Kisi had struggled to keep her cubs alive in the unfamiliar wilderness. Weakened by smoke inhalation and lacking the hunting skills necessary for survival, she was rapidly failing. The cubs, barely weaned and completely dependent, grew weaker with each passing hour. Driven by desperate maternal instinct, Kisi began moving toward the scent of domestic animals and humans, hoping to find food or shelter before her babies died in the harsh Montana wilderness. Atlas had been displaying unusual behavior for 2 days, something Marcus initially attributed to the lingering smoke from distant wildfires affecting the dog's sensitive nose. The German Shepherd would stand motionless at the ranch's eastern fence line, ears erect and body tense, staring into the wilderness for hours at a time. When Marcus called him, Atlas would reluctantly return, but kept glancing back toward the forest with an intensity that seemed almost urgent. On the second morning, Marcus discovered strange tracks in the soft mud near his water trough, paw prints unlike anything he'd seen in Montana. They were too large for a mountain lion, too narrow for a wolf, and had a distinctly feline shape with no claw marks visible. His military training had taught him to pay attention to details that seemed out of place, and these tracks triggered every instinct he'd developed during years of reconnaissance missions. Atlas began disappearing for longer periods, sometimes vanishing before dawn and not returning until late afternoon. When he did come back, his behavior was even more peculiar. The normally disciplined dog would pace restlessly around the house, whining softly and repeatedly looking toward the door as if expecting something to follow him home. His appetite decreased dramatically, though Marcus noticed food disappearing from the dog's bowl faster than Atlas could have eaten it alone. The mystery deepened when Marcus found tufts of golden fur caught on the barbed wire fence that marked his property boundary. The hair was unlike anything from local wildlife, too fine for elk, too light for bear, and completely wrong for any species native to Montana. He collected samples, planning to ask the local wildlife officer about them, but kept forgetting as Atlas's increasingly erratic behavior demanded more of his attention. Strange sounds began emanating from the wooded area behind the barn during the night. Soft chirping noises, almost bird-like but somehow different, would drift across the ranch in the early morning hours. Marcus's combat experience had made him a light sleeper, and these unfamiliar sounds put him on edge. He began keeping his rifle closer, though he couldn't identify exactly what threat he was preparing for. The most unsettling discovery came when Marcus found small bones scattered near his compost pile. Clean bones from what appeared to be rabbits and ground squirrels, but stripped with surgical precision that suggested a predator far more efficient than any local scavenger. Something was hunting on his property, something that killed with the expertise of a creature built for nothing else. The encounter happened at first light on a crisp Thursday morning, when Marcus stepped onto his porch to retrieve firewood. Atlas emerged from the tree line, moving with careful, deliberate steps, his tail held in a neutral position that Marcus recognized as the dog's attempt to appear non-threatening. But it was what followed Atlas that made Marcus freeze completely, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that wasn't there. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 2 small spotted creatures padded behind the German Shepherd, their movements unsteady and uncertain. Even in the dim morning light, Marcus could see they were unmistakably cheetah cubs, their oversized paws and distinctive tear-marked faces making identification immediate. The cubs appeared severely malnourished, their ribs visible through matted fur and their golden coats dulled by days of exposure to smoke and weather. Marcus's military training kicked in as he assessed the situation with tactical precision. The cub showed no fear of Atlas, actually staying close to the dog as if seeking protection. More remarkably, Atlas was exhibiting classic protective behavior, positioning himself between the cubs and any perceived threat, including Marcus himself. The dog's ears were forward and alert, but his posture remained calm, suggesting he didn't view the situation as dangerous. Smaller cub remained pressed against Atlas's side, trembling either from cold, fear, or weakness. Marcus slowly crouched down, making himself less threatening while his mind raced through possibilities. Escaped zoo animals? Illegal exotic pets abandoned during the wildfires? The cub's condition suggested they'd been without proper care for days, possibly weeks. Their eyes held an intelligence that seemed to recognize him as a potential source of help rather than danger. Atlas made a low whining sound, then gently nudged the smaller cub forward with his nose. The gesture was unmistakably encouraging, as if the dog was introducing his new charges to his human partner. The cub responded by taking a few shaky steps toward Marcus, then collapsing onto its belly in exhaustion. Without thinking, Marcus found himself speaking in the same calm, reassuring tone he'd used with injured soldiers in Afghanistan, though he had no idea if these wild babies could understand human intention through voice alone. Marcus's first instinct was to call animal control, but something about the cub's desperate condition made him hesitate. The smaller one, barely breathing and clearly dehydrated, wouldn't survive a bureaucratic process or transport to an overwhelmed wildlife facility. Drawing on his combat medic training, Marcus carefully approached with a bowl of water and some ground beef from his refrigerator, moving slowly to avoid startling the exhausted animals. Atlas remained positioned between Marcus and the cubs, but his body language had shifted to acceptance rather than protection. The dog actually encouraged the interaction by gently pushing the smaller cub toward the offered food with his muzzle. Both cubs ate ravenously, confirming Marcus's assessment that they were dangerously malnourished. He made the decision to focus on immediate survival first, bigger questions later. Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself. Marcus converted an unused horse stall in his barn into a temporary shelter, lining it with old blankets and installing a heat lamp. The German Shepherd took on the role of guardian and companion, sleeping outside the stall and alerting Marcus whenever the cubs needed attention. The surprising maternal instincts on the German Shepherd that once displayed disciplined military dog transformed into a patient, protective caregiver. The cubs, whom Marcus began calling Scout and Sage based on their personalities, responded differently to their new environment. Scout, the larger and more adventurous cub, quickly learned to associate Marcus with food and safety. Within a week, he was following Marcus around the barn and even attempting to play with Atlas. Sage remained more cautious, but slowly began trusting human contact, eventually allowing Marcus to check her for injuries and administer basic veterinary care. Marcus found himself spending hours researching cheetah behavior and nutrition online, transforming his small ranch operation into an impromptu wildlife rehabilitation center. He contacted a veterinarian in Billings who agreed to make house calls without reporting the situation, understanding that these cubs would likely face euthanization if discovered by authorities before they were healthy enough for proper placement. The bond between Atlas and the cubs deepened daily. The dog taught them boundaries around the ranch, led them to safe sleeping spots, and even demonstrated hunting techniques by catching mice and presenting them to the cubs. Marcus documented these interactions with his phone camera, amazed by the cross-species communication he was witnessing. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he felt a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. The crisis began when Marcus's neighbor, retired rancher Bill Henderson, stopped by unexpectedly on a Saturday afternoon to discuss shared fence repairs. Bill had always been respectful of Marcus's need for privacy, but recent cattle losses to predators had made him more vigilant about unusual activity in the area. As his pickup truck rolled up the gravel driveway, Atlas immediately began exhibiting stress behaviors, pacing and whining in ways Marcus hadn't seen since the dog's early PTSD episodes. Scout and Sage were playing near the barn entrance when they heard the unfamiliar vehicle approaching. Their natural flight response kicked in, but instead of running toward the wilderness, they instinctively sought shelter behind Atlas, who was torn between his loyalty to Marcus and his protective instincts toward the cubs. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Bill stepped out of his truck just as Scout, startled by the slamming door, bolted across the open yard in full view. Bill's reaction was immediate and alarmed. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, was that a damn cheetah?" His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and genuine fear as he instinctively reached for the rifle mounted in his truck. Marcus's combat training kicked in as he positioned himself between Bill and the barn, his hands raised in a calming gesture while his mind raced through possible explanations that wouldn't sound completely insane. The confrontation escalated when Sage, hearing raised voices, emerged from the barn and began making the distinctive chirping calls that cheetah cubs use when distressed. Bill's eyes widened as he realized there were multiple exotic predators on the property. His concern shifted from curiosity to legitimate alarm about community safety. "Marcus, what the hell is going on here? Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? There are families with kids living within 10 miles of here." Atlas, sensing the tension between the two men, began exhibiting aggressive protective behaviors Marcus had never witnessed from the normally obedient dog. The German Shepherd positioned himself directly between Bill and the cubs, his hackles raised and a low growl emanating from his throat. This wasn't the disciplined military working dog Marcus knew, but a creature operating purely on protective instinct. Marcus realized that his secret was out, and worse, that Bill was legally and morally obligated to report the situation to authorities. The cub's survival, Atlas's emotional well-being, and Marcus's own future were now hanging in the balance, dependent on his ability to convince a frightened neighbor that this impossible situation somehow made sense. Marcus made a calculated decision that would either save the cubs or destroy everything he'd built. Instead of offering excuses or denying what Bill had witnessed, he invited his neighbor inside for coffee and told him the complete truth about the past 3 weeks. He showed Bill the research he'd been conducting, the veterinary records from the house call visits, and most importantly, the dozens of videos documenting the extraordinary relationship between Atlas and the cubs. Bill's anger slowly transformed into amazement as he watched footage of Atlas teaching Scout to stalk mice, Sage sleeping curled against the German Shepherd's side, and the cubs responding to Marcus's commands with the same obedience they showed their canine guardian. The evidence was overwhelming. These weren't dangerous wild predators terrorizing the countryside, but rescued babies who had formed an unprecedented interspecies family unit. The breakthrough came when Marcus revealed his military background and explained how caring for the cubs had given him the first sense of purpose he'd felt since leaving Afghanistan. Bill, himself a Vietnam veteran, understood the healing power of mission and responsibility. He also recognized that Marcus's expertise with working dogs and his isolated ranch made him uniquely qualified to handle this situation, at least temporarily. However, Bill's acceptance came with harsh reality checks. He had contacts in the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department who would eventually discover the cubs through routine aerial surveys or community reports. More critically, winter was approaching rapidly, and cheetahs were physiologically incapable of surviving Montana's sub-zero temperatures. The cubs would need permanent placement in a climate-controlled facility within weeks, not months. Marcus had already been researching options, but most legitimate sanctuaries had waiting lists measured in years, not weeks. The few facilities with immediate openings were either geographically impossible, requiring transport across multiple states with exotic animal permits Marcus couldn't obtain legally, or had reputations that made him question their animal welfare standards. Bill made a suggestion that initially seemed impossible. His sister Rebecca worked as a veterinary coordinator for the International Cheetah Conservation Foundation, which operated breeding and research programs in Namibia. If the cubs could somehow be transported to Africa, they might have a chance at something approaching a natural life while contributing to species preservation efforts. The conversation that followed would reshape everything Marcus thought he knew about his future, Atlas's destiny, and the cubs' ultimate fate.
Rebecca Henderson's response exceeded every expectation Marcus had dared to harbor. The International Cheetah Conservation Foundation wasn't just interested in Scout and Sage, they were fascinated by the documentation of Atlas's role in their rehabilitation. The foundation had been researching the use of domestic dogs as companion animals for captive cheetahs, based on similar programs at zoos worldwide, but they had never encountered a naturally occurring example of this phenomenon in a rescue situation. Within 2 weeks, Rebecca had secured emergency import permits for the cubs and arranged transportation through a network of wildlife conservation organizations. More surprisingly, she extended an offer to Marcus that would fundamentally change the trajectory of his life. The foundation needed an experienced animal handler to oversee their new companion dog program, and Atlas's proven success with Scout and Sage made him an invaluable research asset. The decision wasn't easy. Marcus would be leaving behind the ranch that had been his refuge, the memories of his grandfather, and the familiar isolation that had helped him process his trauma. But as he watched Atlas playing with the cubs in the barn, he realized that his healing had come not from solitude but from purpose, not from avoiding responsibility, but from embracing it completely. The hardest moment came during the final week before departure. Scout and Sage, now healthy and strong, had grown from helpless babies into playful juveniles who treated the ranch as their territory and Atlas as their pack leader. Marcus understood that separating them during transport could traumatize all 3 animals, undoing months of careful bonding. The foundation agreed to transport them as a family unit, but warned that the cubs would eventually need to be integrated with other cheetahs for breeding purposes. Bill Henderson drove them to the airport at dawn, where a specialized wildlife transport plane waited on the tarmac. As Marcus loaded Atlas's travel crate next to the cubs' reinforced enclosures, he felt the same mixture of anticipation and loss he'd experienced when deploying overseas. The difference was that this time, he was moving towards something meaningful rather than running from something painful. 6 months later, Marcus sent Bill a photo from the Namibian grasslands, Atlas running alongside 2 adolescent cheetahs across an endless savanna, all 3 silhouetted against an African sunset. The message was simple: finally found home. The story doesn't end there. 3 years later, Marcus and Atlas have revolutionized cheetah conservation in Africa. Scout and Sage, now fully grown, have successfully integrated with wild populations while maintaining their unique bond with Atlas. The German Shepherd has become the Foundation's most valuable asset, helping rehabilitate over 30 rescued cheetahs using techniques he developed naturally during those first weeks in Montana. Marcus discovered that his PTSD symptoms virtually disappeared once he found his true calling. The nightmares that had haunted him for years were replaced by dreams of endless savannas and the sound of cheetah cubs playing with their unlikely canine guardian. His children now visit him in Namibia every summer, witnessing firsthand how their father transformed from a broken veteran into a world-renowned conservationist. Bill Henderson still maintains the Montana ranch, but it's now a staging ground for the Foundation's North American operations. Young cheetahs destined for breeding programs spend their final weeks there, learning essential survival skills from a rotation of specially trained dogs before making the journey to Africa. The most remarkable development came last month when Sage gave birth to her first litter. Atlas, now 8 years old and showing gray around his muzzle, immediately assumed grandfather duties, teaching the new cubs the same patience and protection he'd shown their mother years earlier. The circle of life, it seems, has room for the most unexpected families. Marcus often reflects on that October morning when Atlas first brought home 2 dying cubs. One decision to show compassion instead of calling authorities changed not just 3 lives, but created a ripple effect that continues to save an endangered species. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of unlikely animal friendships and human resilience. Like this video if you believe in second chances, and share it with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the most broken souls can heal an entire species.